In the next 3 sections, we'll look at the parts of the head and neck that are involved in 2 vital functions: breathing and eating and drinking. To get a preview of these major topics, we'll look at a specimen that's been divided in the midline. The passage for air and the passage for food and liquid begin separately at the nose and the mouth. Air passes backward through the nasal cavity and the nasopharynx. Food and liquid pass backward through the oral cavity. The 2 passages unite here. Air, food and liquid all pass through this common passage, the oropharynx. The 2 passages separate again here in the hypopharynx. Food and liquid pass backward into the esophagus on their way to the stomach. Air passes forward through the larynx and into the trachea on its way to the lungs. So, the lines of travel for air and for food and liquid cross over in the oropharynx. It's important that air on the one hand and food and liquid on the other hand don't pass upward or downward into the wrong passage. To take care of this, there are important mobile structures above and below the oropharynx that act as separators. These are the soft palate above and the epiglottis and vocal cords below. As we'll see in later sections of this tape, the structures that form the passages for air and for food and liquid are also involved in a further important function: the production of voice sounds. In this section, we'll look at the upper part of the air passage. We'll look at the external nose, the nasal cavities, the paranasal sinuses, and the nasopharynx. We'll start by looking at the bony structures that surround these spaces. The bony opening for the nose is called the piriform aperture. Inside it, there are 2 nasal cavities, a right and a left, separated in the midline by the nasal septum. To get a better look inside, we'll divide the skull in the frontal plane along this line. There's a lot to see here. Let's get ourselves oriented. Here's the hard palate. Here's the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. Here are the medial walls of the orbits. Here are the 2 nasal cavities. The septum dividing them is a little off-center, which is not unusual. The roof of each cavity, formed by the cribriform plate, is very narrow. The medial wall of each nasal cavity, formed by the septum, is smooth and featureless. So is the floor. By contrast, the lateral wall is marked by a number of features, most notably by these 3 delicate bony projections, the conchae, also known as the turbinate bones. This is the inferior concha, this is the middle concha, this is the much smaller superior concha. The 3 conchae partially divide the air passage into 3 parts: the inferior meatus, the middle meatus, and the superior meatus. Here's the back of the orbital cavity. Below it is the hollow space in the maxilla, the maxillary antrum, which we'll look at later. At about the level of the floor of the orbit, the nasal cavity becomes much narrower. The narrowing is caused by the presence of this collection of small hollow spaces, the ethmoid air cells. We'll see more of these in a minute. To see more of the septum and the nasal cavity, we'll look at it in a skull that's been divided just to the left of the midline. Here's the bony part of the nasal septum. It's formed by this part of the ethmoid bone, the perpendicular plate, and by this small bone that we haven't encountered up till now, the vomer. The lowest part of the septum is formed by the maxilla and by the palatine bone. Here's the divided left cribriform plate. This projection above it is something we've seen before. It's the crista galli.